the Americans, they bombed some water facility in Yemen that provides water for 50,000 people. Complete war crime, because the US hasn't declared war on Yemen. There's no congressional authority, and they're attacking civilian infrastructure.
Assault against Iran and its so-called proxies is extremely dangerous. And the message that was sent by the Russians through the defense ministry to the United States is that, well, the United States sent 6 B-2 stealth bombers to Diego Garcia Air Base.
Mhm.
So they now have a range that can hit Iran. But Iran reported, well, we have missiles that can hit Diego Garcia Air Base. And the Russians told the US, Iran has hypersonic missiles that can get to the airbase. So the United States said, okay, we're going to send the THAAD defense system. But the THAAD defense system hasn't worked in Ukraine against hypersonic weapons. If the United States decides it's going to attack Iran on behalf of Bibi Netanyahu, the US military bases throughout the Middle East, Africa, West Asia will all be targets. And the Russians are telling the United States, don't risk it. This is the trigger for a much bigger war. And I think this is where we're going to see whether Trump is serious or not as an anti-war candidate.
He's not anti-war, given what he's doing with Yemen.
Well, the attack on Yemen is an atrocity.
Using Wi-Fi without NordVPN could mean sharing your private stuff with more people than you think. NordVPN. Online security starts with a click.
When tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes a duty. So said Thomas Jefferson. Go to bit.ly/lawful tax protest or bit.ly/make war history and find out why it is a criminal offense to pay central government or local government taxes in the UK. And let's make war history. Hey Harley, thank you so much for making yourself available. Let me just give a timestamp. Friday the 4th of April, 1905, British summertime. I'm joined by Harley Schlanger from the president of the Larouche organization. Subscribe, follow, like, all that business, and I'll have the links for Harley in the description below. How you doing, Harley?
I'm doing fine. It's good to see you.
Yes. I appreciate these monthly calls where I get updated. I'm so grateful. I'm so fortunate. I get to listen to you and find out what's going on with a particular attention to Europe. So it's like my own personalized AI newsfeed. All right. So where do you want to start? France, Germany, the US, Ukraine?
Well, there's so much going on. I think I want to start with something that's a little bit out of the box, which is this guy, Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian investment fund, who is a Putin envoy. He was just in the United States for 2 days. He's the one who met with Witkoff. And what's interesting is for him to come to the United States to go to the White House, they had to lift the sanctions on him. He's one of the people who sanctioned. So they lifted the sanctions. He comes to Washington. And the first thing he says is that the Russian-US dialogue is the most important thing going on in the world. And he said, it's very difficult. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're listening to each other. And this is the solution for the future. And this is really crucial because everything else in the world is going to hell.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Well, the Russians are trying to calm Trump down around Iran with the Chinese. The Chinese and the Russians are saying, look, forget it. You can't go to war with Iran. And so today, Trump, who had said previously, if he's going to have talks with Iran, they have to be direct. And the Ayatollah and the president said, no, they're not going to be direct. They would be indirect. So Trump said, okay, let's have indirect talks. So this is a step forward. And again, it's Russia and China who are putting the pressure on. Now, other than that, look, we were just talking before the program. If you look at France, look what was done.
Before we get to France, I just want to stay with Iran.
Okay.
Because I saw something. I've been very busy with my job this week, so I've not paid attention to a lot to what's going on in the news. But the Americans, they bombed some water facility in Yemen that provides water for 50,000 people. Complete war crime, because the US hasn't declared war on Yemen. There's no congressional authority, and they're attacking civilian infrastructure. So any pronouncements from the Russians and the Chinese or Iran about what the US is doing with Yemen?
Well, I'm not sure if they've said anything specific, other than the Russians and the Chinese are saying that this assault against Iran and its so-called proxies is extremely dangerous. And the message that was sent by the Russians through the defense ministry to the United States is that, well, the United States sent 6 B-2 stealth bombers to Diego Garcia Air Base.
Mhm.
So they now have a range that can hit Iran. But Iran reported, well, we have missiles that can hit Diego Garcia Air Base. And the Russians told the US, Iran has hypersonic missiles that can get to the airbase. So the United States said, okay, we're going to send the THAAD defense system. But the THAAD defense system hasn't worked in Ukraine against hypersonic weapons. So and here's the interesting thing with Iran, if the United States decides it's going to attack Iran on behalf of Bibi Netanyahu, the U.S. military bases throughout the Middle East, Africa, West Asia will all be targets. And the Russians are telling the United States, don't risk it. This is the trigger for a much bigger war. And I think this is where we're going to see whether Trump is serious or not as an anti-war candidate.
He's not anti-war, given what he's doing with Yemen.
Well, the attack on Yemen is an atrocity. And not only that, but to hear the juvenile discussion that went on with people like Waltz and Hegseth about, well, we're hitting them now, we're hitting them, like it's a football game or something.
Mm.
So, and I think, look, there's going to have to be more of a shakeup. You may not have heard about this, but Trump just fired today the head of the cyber command for the United States, Thomas Hoff. And Hoff is the guy who, as part of Russiagate, set up what was called the Russia Small Group Election Security Group, which was designed to, it couldn't do anything to protect the election. It was designed to smear and slander Russia and Trump. So Trump fired him today as part of a group of national security advisors that were fired. So the cleanup of a section of the intelligence community is continuing. But look, the swamp is so big. It's everywhere. And, I think the next guy who has to get fired is Waltz, the national security advisor. And not just because he gave the phone number out for the signal communications discussion about the Yemen bombing, but he's a hardcore neocon. So is Hegseth. Hegseth, do you know this? Hegseth he's a member of the Temple Mount Group, which is an organization of radical Zionists that intends to tear down the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to build the third temple. How do you have a defense secretary who's part of a cult?
And there are pictures, I don't know if they're photoshopped, I've seen where he has the word kafir. I'm careful not to say kafir, which is something completely different I drink, but kafir, that's it, kafir, in Arabic, tattooed. Now, is it photoshopped? I don't know, right? But according to the caption, it isn't, but it fits with what you're saying. And the idea of destroying the Dome and the Rock, Muslims that's not going to fly with Muslims. That's not at all.
Of course not. But that's what the extremist settlers have been calling for a long time. Yeah. And this fits into the whole Christian Zionist picture. Because the Christian Zionism, so-called, and I say Christian in quotes, what they basically say is that you have to move the majority of the world's Jews to Israel and then bring on the Battle of Armageddon, which will include the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the construction of the third temple. And once the third temple is constructed, then there'll be the Battle of Armageddon. Most of the Jews will be killed in that. 144,000 will survive, and they'll be the ones who accept Jesus when Jesus returns. It's cultish nonsense. I'm just reading a very interesting book called Dark Crusade by a former top Senate staffer, in which he traces this back to none other than Lord Palmerston, that the original British Israelite was Lord Palmerston, who was trying to figure out how to outflank the remnants of the Napoleonic grouping that had gone to Egypt to capture Jerusalem for the French.
Always the British. Always, all roads lead to London, right? And I think, was it the Schofield Bible that
Yes.
they reprinted the Bible and put in this story that you've just told us about in order to create this vein of Christian Zionism, these Christians that support Zionism because it will lead to the coming of the Messiah.
Well, around Palmerston, you had a group that called themselves the British Israelites. And one of the people who was recruited to that was the son of Queen Victoria, who later became the king. And he set up something called the Palestine Exploration Fund to scout out the best spots for the British oligarchy when they moved to Palestine. So there's an element of this which is the cultish nonsense, it's Freemasonic and so on, of the British aristocracy. But with the Schofield Bible, they moved it to the United States and distributed it to primarily Southern Baptists initially. And it's now, there are estimates that about 40% of Trump's base are these Christian Zionists who believe. I mean, I used to make a joke when I lived in the South that the only time these people were in contact with Jews was when they were burning crosses in their yards. Now they claim to be the great lovers of the Jewish people because the Jewish sacrifice will bring on the return of Jesus. So it's bizarre. And it's that kind of cultism that exists in Israel among the settler movement. But the good side is that you were talking earlier about people waking up. 100,000 people in the streets in Israel last Saturday night protesting Netanyahu. Now you have the fight going on over the aides of his who were running the Qatar operation, that is, running basically money laundering from Qatar to the Hamas. And this ultimately gets back to Netanyahu. So there's a funny Jerusalem Post story. Imagine this: Netanyahu is in his trial for bribery and corruption, and it's interrupted so he can be brought to another police station to talk about his aides who were just caught on the Qatar corruption case.
Wow. They're all gangsters. A lot of them, they're all gangsters sacrificing
Yeah.
ordinary people for their vainglorious ambition. Okay.
So now to tie this together, the Iran Bibi Netanyahu story with the United States, there's a part of this which includes the so-called signal gate, the story of the unprotected, unsecure call that's targeting the people that Trump brought in to take out the deep state networks. In other words, who's being focused on? Ratcliffe at the CIA, Patel at the FBI, and Tulsi Gabbard. These are the ones who were grilled during the hearings because they want to use this to knock out the better people in Trump's internal security network so that the only thing that you have left are Christian Zionists and neocons.
Right.
Now, I wish Trump had some understanding of this. I don't think he does. I think this is something that he adopted, a support of being a Zionist, as he says, because he realized that this is an important part of the money going into U.S. elections. The Zionist lobby contributes huge amounts. I mean, Miriam Adelson gave $100 million to the Trump campaign. So, this is part of his election strategy. Is he a Christian Zionist? I doubt it. I don't think he even knows the deeper issues involved.
Right. Now, Tulsi Gabbard, she's turned because before she was in this administration, she was critical of the assault on Yemen previously, or how the UK and the UK again and the US was supporting Saudi Arabia's murderous onslaught
Yeah.
of the Yemenis people. And then recently she said that she came out and said, look, we don't have any the intelligence we have is that Iran isn't building a nuclear bomb. But now she's saying she's in support of the attack on Yemen, which isn't going to work. The Yemenis have got, it's a fight for their survival. What I think is likely is they will just up the tempo.
Well, and let's keep in mind, what is it that Yemen is doing? They're saying that they're going to hold up shipping as long as the Israelis are committing genocide against the Palestinians. So when there was the ceasefire, they stopped shooting rockets, they stopped boarding ships, they backed off. They're the most principled people, ironically, in the whole region. And the attack against them was not against the Houthi leadership, although um, Hegseth said that, yeah, we're getting their leaders. They got a lot of civilians. They destroyed homes. It was not a targeted and effectively targeted operation. But on Gabbard, her weakness is the extent to which she has some connection with the BJP party in India. And it's not a direct connection. She's part of a Hindu grouping that has ties with Modi's Hindu nationalists. And Modi, because of the fight between Hindus and Muslims in India, has tended to lean towards supporting Israel, although India at this point is being fairly even-handed on this. The person to watch in India is Jai Shankar, the foreign minister, who's actually very close to the BRICS countries, China and Russia. But Gabbard is influenced by this internal Hindu operation. And I think that's why she's so bad on the Middle East when she's very good on almost everything else.
Mm, mm.
But on Syria, she was also very good because she was blowing the whistle on the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is an operation of the British Foreign Office.
Oh, the British again.
You
Ali, I just want
can't
to.
escape it. I mean, you know what they
Don't
say.
escape it, no.
My friend Ray McGovern says that his grandfather used to tell him, you know why the sun doesn't set on the British Empire? Because God doesn't trust them in the dark.
Yes, 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 and quite right too. Absolutely. Harley, I just want to acknowledge you for just your grip on what is going on at macroeconomic level. So I do invite and encourage people to go follow Harley because you do daily news reports as well, short 10, 15-minute videos, weekdays, where you let people know what's going on. And you write great articles, which people can find through the Larouche organization. Okay,
Thank you.
Germany. You and I were talking about what was happening in
Yeah.
Germany and France.
Okay, Germany. Friedrich Merz has betrayed his own party. And that's because he's not really a Christian Democrat. He's a BlackRock speculator operative. He was the head of BlackRock Germany for 6 years before he went back into politics. The reason he got out of politics is that Merkel beat him. He was the main opponent to Merkel and the Christian Democrats earlier in the century, and Merkel beat him. And so what did he do? He decided to get rich and became part of a mergers and acquisitions law firm, and then from there went to BlackRock. Now, when the Schultz coalition came in, the red, green, black coalition, Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the Free Democrats, Merz reemerged because it was clear that the Schultz coalition didn't have a clue what to do. The idea of the green transition is destroying Germany's auto industry, which is destroying the engineering and tech sector of Germany. And Annalena Baerbock, as a foreign minister, is a joke. She doesn't know a damn thing about diplomacy. So Merz was used with a lot of funding and a lot of media support to get rid of Schultz. And the Schultz government has collapsed the German economy. It's going through a rapid deindustrialization. So they said, Merz is a businessman. He knows what to do. He's a conservative, free market guy. Well, what he wants to do is have a reflation based on a war buildup. So it's same thing Starmer's doing, same thing Macron is doing. The idea that if you don't know how to fix the economy, have a war, and then issue bonds that will go to the war industry, and then you can bring in the private sector to buy those bonds, and so you can have a short-term bailout. So that's basically what's going on in Europe. And Merz made the mistake of coming in at a point in which Germany is starting to move from being a creditor nation to a debtor nation. So Germany has in its constitution this thing called the debt brake, which limits the percent of debt that can be accrued, the deficit spending, to the total income. And that's supposedly there to keep Germany solvent. Well, Merz decided to change the constitution because you couldn't have a reflationary rearmament plan and still have the debt brake. So here he is, he ran for office promising to keep the debt brake and keep Germany solvent. And as soon as he's elected, he turns around and says, no, we're going to get rid of the debt brake and change the Constitution. Now, that didn't sit well with the Christian Democratic voters. But more importantly, in order to do it, he had to do it with the old parliament, because the new parliament wouldn't have had a 2/3 majority to change the Constitution. So here he is, he comes in an election, and instead of waiting for the new government to be seated, he used the old government to ram through the change. And his old colleagues said, just see this as a dirty trick. So his support has collapsed. He had about 30 or 29%, I think, in the last election. And within 2 months, he's down now to 25%. And the Alternative for Deutschland, the so-called right-wing extremist nationalist party, is now at 24%. They're 1 percentage point behind the CDU. And the coalition of the CDU and the SPD, the socialists, it's not working. So now there's talk there may be a new election before the end of this year. So Germany is in a state of chaos. And they're not helped by Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, whose whole strategy is rearm Europe. 800 billion euro fund to go into armaments. So that's the German situation. And in the meantime, they're cracking down on dissent. They're passing laws that would make it legal for them to spy on every phone call. It really is looking more and more like the East German Stasi state. And that's one of the reasons the voters in East Germany voted against the government. And because they already have seen this. They said, we've been there, done that, we don't want it again. So it's a chaotic situation.
Okay, completely chaotic. And the idea of elections at the end of this year, I'm sure the European Union will work out some way to finagle them so that
you can bet on that.
like in Romania and France recently.
What they did in France was the Romania model.
Right. Lawfare. But Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, what was her crime? It was fraud, and then she won't release the contract details that she had with Pfizer, and she got convicted, and she got let off. No prison time for her or anything.
Her husband was a representative of Pfizer, and the EU under von der Leyen gave an exclusive contract to Pfizer around COVID. I mean, it's just totally corrupt, completely.
Yeah.
And so you have this unelected bureaucracy that's making the policy. And then I did an interview the other day with the number 2 Alternative for Deutschland member of the European Parliament, who tried to get recognized to speak in the parliamentary session on the vote for the 800 billion euro, what they're calling the financial bazooka for rearmament. They would not allow him to speak. And when he stood up and said, I demand to be able to speak, they removed him from the parliamentary chambers. So here we are, the bastion of democracy, canceling an election in Romania. Just one thing worth noting on the Le Pen case. I don't agree with everything Le Pen stands for, but she is a nationalist and she's opposed to Macron and the war buildup. What they got her for is what every single party in the European Parliament does. It's this thing when you have to, how do you distinguish between the party members who serve in the offices, who on the one hand are doing European Parliament work, and on the other hand are working to maintain relations with the constituents back in the home country? The money gets mingled.
Yeah.
And maybe they weren't clever enough to fix the books. But the idea that she's now not allowed to run for president, this is designed to create an explosion in France, and it already is.
Yeah, I mean, this is the globalists have used lawfare against Le Pen, against Trump, against Georgescu in Romania, against Bolsonaro in Brazil, against Imran Khan in Pakistan. Everywhere lawfare. And
it's the same playbook.
The same playbook, and election rigging as well.
Actually, Rich, this is interesting. Di Pietro, who was the judge in Italy, who ran the Clean Hands program, which brought down the old political parties, including Berlusconi's party, the big corruption scandal of about 10 years ago. Di Pietro came out and said that, well, that the case that was brought against Le Pen was much worse even than what he did. That is, the case was a fraud. He's admitting that his whole case was a fraud.
Wow.
And now he's saying they're just doing it again and again and again.
Wow. Wow. And then the politicians that actually have some level of integrity, like Jeremy Corbyn, like Trump, right? His Zionism politics aside, right? Because he got, I don't know how many millions of dollars the FBI spent on going through his life, and they found nothing that was indictable without twisting the law. They get smeared because they're a challenge. You know, you can't go and try and bribe Jeremy Corbyn. Go and have a go. I remember just a slight aside, Harley. I remember the expenses scandal in the UK. I remember going through all the claims that the different MPs had made and stuff because it was published. And Jeremy Corbyn, £10 for a printer cartridge. That was it. That was it.
And meanwhile, the city of London is laundering hundreds of billions of dollars in drug money and getting away with it.
Yep. Yep. Well, here we go. Here we go with London again, right? All roads lead to London. Okay, so Le Pen was found guilty and given a suspended sentence, and also house arrest, which meant that she couldn't go out and about campaigning for National Front. And then today, I think there was an appeal, and her appeal has been successful. Like the charges have been held, so she will be able to campaign.
Well, it's still, you got to realize the French do things in a very strange way. So they haven't fully cleared her to campaign.
Right.
And the longer appeal has to do with the actual charges, not with the way the case was run. So the government's still going to try and prove that she did something wrong and therefore she can't run. But her case is that the case against her was a fraud. So it's sort of a dual level, and you have the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court, and we know something about this because my associate in France, Jacques Cheminade, who has run for president a couple of times, during one of his campaigns, they accused him of stealing money from his contributors. Now, when contributors give money to a campaign, they're giving it to the campaign. They don't want it back. And they brought a court case against Cheminade saying that he was keeping the money that he was supposed to return. And so they kept him from running again.
Right.
So the French legal system is pretty bizarre.
Yes. And then so 20,000 new people joined Marine Le Pen's party today, or recently, since this court case. And I imagine the support for her will just grow and grow and grow. And as Georgescu's support has grown, because there'll be people who haven't necessarily been active or don't necessarily support him, perhaps they're on the left, they're like, oh my God, this is appalling. You know, people who have principle.
What's interesting, just one other thing, is that Macron, of course, has been parading around with Starmer as the great defenders of Europe from Russia. And they're going to have the so-called coalition of the willing. Now, ironically, they took the term from George W. Bush, the coalition of the willing, to fight in Iraq based on complete lies and false terms. Last Sunday, the New York Times had a 13,000-word article about how virtually everything that was said about Russia on the Ukraine war was a lie.
Yeah.
And that the U.S. was the partner in the war with Ukraine, not a supporter, but actually had American bases in Ukraine, and what was being done to organize the Ukrainian army was out of the U.S. base in Wiesbaden, Germany. And so here you have this lengthy article in the Times, which could have been written 2-3 years ago. This is what I was saying. Alex Kreiner was talking about this. This is what Scott Ritter and others were saying. So the Times, the paper of record, finally says it. And yet nothing changes. Starmer's still saying, we've got to stand up against Russia. Macron, I brought this up because a section of the French officer corps retired, has been supporting quietly the Ralliement, the Le Pen party, but in the back rooms. Now they're starting to come out openly. And they're warning that there might be a danger of a civil war in France if Le Pen is kept off the ballot. So this is where you're seeing a shift going on. Now, interestingly, the same thing's happening in Israel because you have a retired officers group called the Commanders of the country, and 70% of them are now calling for Netanyahu to step down. And they're one of the issues between Netanyahu and the head of the Shin Bet, Ronan Bar, is that Netanyahu is trying to blame Bar for Hamas breaking through on October 7th. The Shin Bet should have known this. The Shin Bet is internal security. They should have known it. They should have stopped it. Well, Bar is prepared to go public that it was Netanyahu who kept them from being prepared.
Yeah.
So you have these corrupt autocratic governments that are supposedly democracies that are losing their credibility. And they're pushing for war, as Netanyahu is, as Macron is, as Starmer is, as Merz is.
Yeah.
Now, for the first time, there are German troops now permanently stationed in Lithuania.
Yes. Yes. Well, that will prevent Russia. That will really stop Russia. Because Russia really wants little Lithuania because it has no resources of its own, none whatsoever. Lithuania's got everything.
Yeah.
Now, as they get more and more authoritarian, people will push back more.
That's right.
And then as people push back more, the governments will get more and more authoritarian. And you said earlier about France exploding. How do you see it playing out in France?
Well, already the French agricultural sector is up in arms because they never got what they were promised last year. Remember, the farmers were demonstrating last year in France because of the high prices of fertilizer and the low price for their milk products. And they went on strike about the same time you had the revolt against the raising of the retirement age. So there were very wild demonstrations in France each of the last 2 years. Now, the agricultural sector is saying that the European policy around green transition is making it impossible for farmers to stay in business. The new regulations, supposedly to stop the release of toxic gases and methane and things of that sort.
Cow farts. Cow farts are way more damaging than bombs.
Yes.
Cow farts are going to destroy people's lives. Not war doesn't.
Yeah. And so the French farmers are already in revolt. And now you have the Le Pen party. You have the unions who are opposed to this idea of raising the retirement age. So Macron is now below 20% in the polls. So how can he survive? It's going to be an extremely rocky period in Europe as a whole. And look, at some point, something's going to happen in our beloved England, because what Starmer's doing is not going to do a damn thing to help the population. The economy is rapidly collapsing. If you really want to have a military buildup in Great Britain, how do you do it? You buy American weapons. That's really the problem that Europe has deindustrialized to the extent that there are some weapons manufacturers. Rheinmetall in Germany is a big one. But on the whole, there's not an armaments industry that could support a war against Russia. So who are you kidding when you say to the Russians, we're going to stand up and stop you? I mean, first of all, the Russians know they're not going to attack. So they're not exactly quaking in their boots when Starmer talks about the coalition of the willing. There was
Harley, sorry, the Russians going to be like, all right, here we go again. Go on, have a go if you think you're hard enough.
Well, they were saying they may be willing, but they're not able.
Yeah.
And there was another one that called it the coalition of the wilting.
Yeah, that's accurate. Cool. I like that, coalition of the wilting. Yes, definitely wilting. Please carry on.
Well, but here's where you see, how did the world get so crazy? Because the Russians are at a point where they could finish this war. Zelensky is trying to extend it. he's not even a legitimate president. And the idea that the Western countries are going to commit themselves for the next 100 years to a war against Russia. And this is where Lavrov is basically saying, why? Why don't we talk? We have legitimate security demands. So does Ukraine. We'll give them their security demands, their legitimate security protection. And that won't even be discussed. This guy, Dmitriev, who came to the United States representing Putin, made an important point. He said, we haven't been able to talk to the US government the last 3 years because of Biden. Just the fact that we're talking now and listening to each other is crucial. And the same thing could be said of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. If you raise the question of genocide against the Palestinians, you're accused of being pro-terrorist. The censorship and the control of the narrative is one of the most distressing aspects of this whole thing. And then when people stand up, as in the case of this young woman in Massachusetts who wrote in her campus newspaper an op-ed defending the Palestinians, she gets dragged in off the street.
Yep. It's horrific. Now, it's good that the Russians and the Ukrainians the Russians and the Americans are talking, and it's interesting that it's the guy who's in charge of the Russian investment bank, and not not someone from the foreign, like a foreign secretary, not Lavrov or one of his.
Well, Lavrov is plugged in. That there's no question.
I'm sure he's plugged in, right? But but the investment bank.
Well, Putin is basically saying to Trump, let's get this war out of the way so we can start doing business.
Right.
That's the issue. And that's the issue that intrigues Trump, whether he's interested in raw materials or markets or, there may be an element in Trump where he's hoping that they could use Russia to counter China. That's not going to work. But what Putin is basically saying is, we have more important things to do in this world than fight wars. Let's work together, resolve this, and then figure out some things of how do we have a system that makes it easier for trade so that we don't have to go through a dollar exchange. And this is something that some Americans think this is going to crash the dollar. Now, what's going to crash the dollar is the tariff policy.
Okay. Because I was going to ask you about that. And the impact on Europe, I'm particularly interested in. But start with, how's it going to crash the dollar?
Well, what's happening is that the fear is that this will trigger a new inflation. And the trade war will hurt all parties. Now, the idea that Trump has that we need reciprocal tariffs, well, that's something you can negotiate. That's not something you do with a slam down your fist and say, everyone's going to have to pay this. If he can make the case that there's unfair trade practices, then he should do it. And that should be a negotiated settlement. The problem is that they're taking abstract figures and assigning it to proof that there's unfair trade. Now, where does the unfair trade come from? Well, this is the World Trade Organization. This is what the United States forced on the rest of the world. Wall Street and the City of London said we need to have a free trade system. And countries like China took advantage of it. Now, is that wrong for them? I mean, they did it because they intended to use the expanded trade to raise a whole section of their population out of poverty. And they did it. So is that unfair? So, the problem with just slapping tariffs on everything, what it means right now is that every car from Europe or Japan or South Korea that's sold in the United States is going to be marked up 25%. Now, how many people can afford that? The car sales have been low in the last 18 months in the United States already because of inflation. Now you're adding an extra 25% to it. What will that do? The question, what Trump is saying is, well, that will help American manufacturers. The problem with that argument is American manufacturers are not getting the credit. And that's why Trump is now saying, today he came out and said the Federal Reserve has to lower interest rates. But the Federal Reserve is not going to lower interest rates because they're afraid of inflation coming back. So it's a catch-22. You can't fight inflation with tariffs, and you can't fight unfair trade practices when you have credit, money creation going into speculation, when you want the credit to go into industry and production. And if you have green regulations on top of that, if you have deregulated banking, there's no way to ensure that money that's created is going to go to the areas that you want, like new plant and equipment, job training, and so on. So this is where Trump should take a look at what John Kennedy was trying to do in the spring of 1963 with the investment tax credit. What Kennedy said is, we'll give you tax credits if you put the money into expanding the business, increasing production, improving productivity, new technology, research and development. If you don't do that, we're not going to give you a tax credit. What Trump did in the first term, and this was because he was advised by Wall Street guys like Mnuchin, what he did is he said, we'll give you a tax credit or a tax return. We'll cut your taxes and you can do whatever you want with it, as long as it makes money. So what did the companies do? They bought their own stock, because the CEOs of these companies, their bonuses depends on how well the stock does. So they were buying stock in companies which were not producing enough to cover their debts. So it was a double negative for the economy. But in the short term, it looked good because it was creating a flow of money. So if the billionaires were going out buying yachts and Lamborghinis, that was mixed into the GDP, and they said, look, the economy's growing. Meanwhile, they're shutting down whole sections of their plants and equipment. So what's necessary is investment in physical economy. And that includes especially new technologies, research and development, job training. And then from that standpoint, you create new markets by developing new products.
Okay. Well, just on the Trump tariffs, my understanding, the idea is that manufacturing will return and grow and expand in the United States because it's such a large consumer market. But also, at some point down the line, he's talking about giving tax cuts to people, which will put more money in their pocket, and then some of that money is going to be invested into businesses, and then along the part of that is cutting all the excess bureaucracy and the wasteful expenditure, which is what Doge is doing.
Well, that's the nice story. As I said, the reality, Trump is talking about how successful the tax cuts were in the last time. And what Trump should realize, and this is something that some of his people do understand, is that what he criticized Biden for, Biden had because of the low interest rates, there was a growth in the stock, improvement in the stock market. And that was called a good, healthy economy. Actually, I'm saying that's what was done under Obama. And Trump correctly criticized that running for president in 2016. And he said that it was not a real investment-led boom. Now then, he did the same thing with his tax cut. They gave extra money back to the corporations, and the corporations used some of the tax cut to pay down debt, but they used a lot of it just to buy their own stock. And so on the books, it looked like it worked really nicely. But in reality, the companies were increasing the debt without increasing their productive capability. The whole point of a credit system is you take on debt to expand your productive capability, to improve it, either to find new markets, new products, ways of increasing the productivity. If you're just doing it to take the extra money and buy stock and make money for the company, that's the difference between liquidity and solvency. If the Federal Reserve throws money into these corporations so they can, in the short term, cover their debts with the new credit they're getting, the books will look okay, except if you look 6 months down the road, because they've just increased the debt without improving the ability to pay it in the future. And so what has to be done is worry about solvency of corporations and governments, as opposed to, is there enough liquidity? And that's why the whole Federal Reserve System and monetary policy is rife with fraud, because you can manipulate the numbers to make it look like there's growth.
Yep. And you can have your own magic money machines to print dollars off the books. And I suspect there's going to be more of those that are going to be found.
Well, Larouche used to raise the question, if you had $10,000 to invest, would you put it into a new steel manufacturing plant or into a whorehouse? Because in the short term, you'd make a better profit from the whorehouse.
Yes.
And that's monetary policy.
All right. Harley, thank you. In the remaining minutes left, I want to go to Europe, sorry, to the UK. And you said about Starmer, and I can see it here because they're raising taxes, raising household bills for all the utilities, increasing business costs through so that small businesses, which are the largest employment sector in the UK, they struggle. And it's really surprising because Starmer is such a capable, charismatic, intelligent leader with just the levels of integrity that are just ridiculous. So it's surprising that he's doing so badly.
Sounds like you're reading the Guardian talking points.
Yes, yeah. Well, actually, what's interesting is how much focus there is on Trump and in the Guardian, how much focus there is on Trump and in Ukraine and everything, and so little on the evil machinations of this government. The assisted dying bill, which had all these protections in the beginning, that it was just going to be for a small cohort of people, where it's considered they only had 6 months left to live, and it would be overseen by a judge. Okay, we got rid of the judge, and now it's a panel of social workers and psychiatrists. They get to decide, oh, it is not just people who've got 6 months to live. It's if someone's got a disability, or if someone's got anorexia, they can opt for euthanasia, or even if they think they're going to be a financial burden on their family, they can opt for the government to murder them.
Yeah.
That doesn't get covered. Those sorts
Well,
of
it should get covered, because this is the front end of a policy of genocide.
Yeah.
And the idea that you don't take into consideration the psychological effects on someone who has a long-term illness or financial problems or
depression.
depression. And you can convince someone that their family would be better off if they were gone.
Yeah.
And first of all, I think there's no legitimate reason for assisted suicide policy. But if you have something like that, you have to have protections. And the problem is that they're not very good at these protections, because the goal is to reduce the number of so-called useless eaters. Now, that was the Hitler policy that was developed out of the Wannsee Conference in 1942, where they basically said that we have all these useless eaters who aren't producing anything, and we can put them to work in concentration camps and work them to death. But at a certain point, that's not very effective. So the earlier part of the Hitler concentration camp was movement under Hjalmar Schacht and Albert Speer, was to produce cheap labor. But at a certain point, if you give people 1,000 calories a day for consumption and work them 12 to 16 hours, they die. And it's not a very productive system. And at a certain point, they just decided these are useless eaters. They have lives not worth living. Let's just get rid of them.
Yeah.
And then you factor in racism, you factor in eugenics. And I think you're absolutely right that this points to a fundamental immorality, which, if you think about it, the whole element of life today is, if you can't have the enjoyment and pleasures, whether it's drugs or recreation or sex, if you can't have that, your life isn't worth anything. And there are too many young people who are seeing that in the culture.
Yeah, and I think it sets a really dangerous precedent that somehow that the government then has the say over life and death, and that it's legitimate for the government to kill its own citizenry.
Yeah.
Which is war being brought home, and then the government gets to save money on pension payments, and the whole thing about the war and impoverishing people in Britain. Well, then the one way you can earn money is you can go and join the army to go slaughter yourself, commit suicide against Russia. and then we don't have pension payments, and then we get to replace European citizenry with all the people that we brought in from foreign lands.
Well, Rich, with all this talk, let me just give a little bit of bright light to something. If you take a look at what's going on with the Global South, you'll find that there's all kinds of plans for economic development, great projects, water projects, nuclear power, high-speed rail. And these are countries that are now under attack by the International Monetary Fund. One case in particular is Indonesia, which has become a very successful country, but they're now being squeezed by the IMF. Pakistan, as you know, is going from one IMF program to another. These are the economic hitmen that come in and tell you what you can and can't do. But more and more, whole sections of the world are rebelling against that. And with the support of countries like China, Russia, what if Europe decided to make its goal not fighting a war against Russia, but alleviating poverty in Africa? Why not?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Harley, on that note, we're going to have to finish up because I've run out of power and I'm not getting any power. I've got 1% left, right? Really,
Okay.
really appreciate this conversation. I'll have the links to you in the description, but I look forward to speaking to you again in about a month's time.
Okay. Good
Surprise.
talking with you.
All the best.
Bye-bye.